From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Tomoko Steen. I'm a research specialist here at the Library of Congress. Today's event is sponsored by Science, Technology, and Business Division, and also through Marvin McFarland grant. And last several years, we've been talking about the big data, and because of the new paradigm shift of the, we have a technology to produce big data. Many different disciplines of the science producing scientific big data. But the main problem is managing it and also how to make accessible. And today's story is a success story. And today's speaker, Dr. Guala, managed interesting system. It's called Bison, and he will talk to you a lot about these new development and also the how we can make the biodiversity data accessible. Dr. Guala is branch chief for, it's complicated, eco-science synthesis in the core science system mission area of USGS. And also he's a director of Integrated Taxonomic Information System, ITIS program. Before further ado, please join me welcoming Dr. Guala.
Thank you, Tomoko. Good morning, everyone. Nice to be here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about big data that's a little different than the big data that you always hear about. When you hear about big data in the news, it's usually credit card data or telephone data or things that marketing companies use to do marketing because they're putting a big investment in it, and it really is very lucrative to look at big data. And part of the idea of big data is if you have enough data, even very subtle statistical trends can be teased out of the data just because you have enough data to keep retesting the same hypothesis. It's just like in the last election, in the last presidential election, Nate Silver had 538.com, and everyone was saying the election's going to be really, really close. And Nate said, no, really, we have enough data here. It's not going to be close. It's going to be close in every little election in every state, but the big trend is going to be a landslide, and that's what happened. So it's that's a big data kind of analysis. And I'm going to go through, like I said, some things you may not have thought of that are big data uses in biodiversity science. So a year ago, well, I don't know, April of 2013, we released a database called Bison. You don't have to read that. The important things are, I'm going to describe it in a minute, but it's the National Clearinghouse for Biodiversity Occurrence Data in the U.S., and it got we had some good quotes. You'll see in there, there's a quote from Rosina Bierbaum, and you may not know who she is, but she was the co-author of a very influential report in 2011 by the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. And that council has a lot of high-powered people on it. Eric Schmidt from Google's on it, Craig Mundy from Microsoft, Dan Schrag is a Nobel laureate. There are people like that who are on it, and she gave us a quote that said, I'm paraphrasing, but she said, "This is exactly what you should do. Do more of it." And I thought, excellent, And then we had, there's a quote in here from Mary Klein, who's president and CEO of NatureServe. And she was saying basically the same thing, and we want to work with you. So that shows that, you know, we have people outside of government who appreciate this. So what is it? It's the National Clearinghouse for Biodiversity Data. I'll show you what that means in a minute. It's the U.S. node of the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, and I'll show you more about GBIF in a few minutes. We share all of our data, well, almost all of it, with GBIF, and they share all of their data with us. So it works out really well. We have 168 million records right now, but we have about 80 million records in the hopper, ready to go in. So we will, I think it's a very safe bet, we will pass 250 million records in 2015. So yeah, I don't have a very big staff. They're working very hard. It's every state and county, every congressional district, any way you can divide the country, we got points there. We have 55 environmental layers in Bison that you can sort of superimpose things on, and that becomes very useful because then you can look at trends, environment versus distribution, things like that. And these records, the minimum, there's a lot of other data in there, but the minimum that we require is some person with a name observed some species of something on a specific date at a specific place. And usually that place has a latitude and longitude on it, okay? And there are 314 what we call providers. Those are the big entities, like the Smithsonian is a provider. But within the Smithsonian, there's the mammal range and the insect range and the herbarium. Those are all what we would call data sets. And they're about, I think there are about 3,000 data sets in there. And these providers come across the spectrum, you know, academia, NGOs, NatureServe's in there, for example. Lots and lots of universities, state government data sets, tons of stuff that was funded by NSF. And also I know this is not really a technical audience, but I'm gonna keep mentioning some stuff about web services because they're really important in this realm. All right, so these are just some of the federal data sets in Bison, and you'll see Smithsonian's there. USDA plants database, whole thing's in there. That's comprehensive plant data at the county level for the U.S. That's every species, and it's very useful to us. The Forest Service, USDA Forest Service, the forest inventory, we have all the trees in there. That's 20 million records of trees. And we're about to put the forbs and other things in there. So we have a lot of records in there. And we have a lot of federal data, and we're about to put the National Park Service NP species in there. It'll be at a low resolution at this point, but we'll work over the next year to get that to a higher resolution. That's a couple million points. You know, we're right now, Bison's fairly young, but we're trying to pull in data from other federal agencies right now, primarily, and also we have two thematic areas. One is invasive species, and one is pollinators. And we're actually putting some money on the landscape with universities and NGOs to become the go-to place for pollinator data and the go-to place for invasives data. So what is it? People mostly come to Bison for maps and checklists, and those are just some of the kinds of things that you can get. You can get a map or a checklist for any area. And you can search it. Basis of record means, is it a fossil, is it a living specimen, is it a museum specimen, or was it an observation, that kind of thing. You can search but in a year range. I only want to see stuff that was there between 1900 and 1920. You know, you can do things like that. And we put everything in points now because it makes it computationally easy. But if it's a known centroid, meaning it just says it was in this county, and that's the most we know about it, then we make it abundantly clear to you that that's a county centroid, and it's not, everything didn't occur in the center of that county. So One of the most popular things we do is you can draw a polygon. See, this is a polygon around Shenandoah National Park near here, and you draw that polygon and click on it, and there's a bunch of points in Shenandoah National Park. And if you click on one of those points, you get a lot more information from that point. And see, this one has actually 10 records under that point. Someone found 10 different things at that place. This is actually very out of date. You see, it's back when it was in beta. We actually have 43 fields of data now that you can get, and that includes sound files, movies, images, literature. You know, whatever we have that's connected to that record is in every point. And we have a couple more download formats that you can have. So you actually, if you have enough bandwidth, you can draw, you know, a gigantic area of the U.S. and download all the data into a spreadsheet. It's unlikely you'll have the bandwidth or the CPU to use it, but you can do huge data sets right out of Bison. They all work that way. And if you download a shapefile or KML, you can pop it into your own system or into Google Earth. So you don't even need extra software. Like I said, I'm going to mention these extended web services because they're important. And also, I know you guys probably don't know, or a lot of you might not know what JSON and JSONP and XML are, but the reason I'm mentioning is that because some of you probably have children and they're smarter than we are and they know what this means, okay? Now, the big thing is JSON is a format that comes out of databases. JSONP is a way to do that where you don't need, it's a way to circumvent some of the programming that you need on the back end. So everything you see here are little widgets that we have available. We'll give them to you. We don't even need any credit for them. But all of those graphs and maps and things, they'll update automatically. These are all cut and paste widgets. You put them on your website or your desktop. They'll run from either one as long as you have an internet connection. You don't have to connect them. You don't have to do software service connections and all kinds of exotic stuff. You just paste them and they work. And they work really robustly. So this is just maps that you can put on your own website. There are a bunch of graphs that we can do. This is a mashup of a couple different databases that we have, and so you can superimpose these layers. And this is a regression, and this is a trillium, a little wildflower, spring wildflower. And if you look at that regression line, it's going down. Does anyone know why that might be? It's actually going down, and then the trend is also that the blooming season is widening. The reason I use that one is because it's an ephemeral bloomer, so it's only ever collected when it's in bloom. So if I have a point, I can generally assume that it was probably in bloom when it was collected. So this would mean that it's blooming earlier in the spring. Yeah. And we see that. And the nice thing about big data and being able to use big data techniques is 10 years ago, I spent about 5.5 months doing 100 species like this, getting the data together and calculating regression lines for them. And I wrote this little program in an hour, and I sat at home, and I said, okay, Bison, give me the regression line. And it said, what species? And I said, all of them. I put in a star. And it started, these graphs just started appearing, and it did 58,000 species for me. And it did it in an hour, you know, I mean, and it would have done it in seconds if I, you know, if I had enough bandwidth at my house, it would have done it in seconds. So that's a tenet of big data. You take the analysis to the data. You don't take the data to the analysis. If I had to even, you know, before I had to go out to all these different providers and get the data and bring it into my system and then get them all in the same format and analyze them. Even if I had done that, I still couldn't analyze them on my computer. I would never have that kind of computing power. This way I'm telling Bison, it's sitting on a big cluster at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, I'm saying, compute this, and it'll do it. It loves to do stuff like that. So that's part of the big data thing. It's economies of scale and having the data all in the same format, and it's having the computing power near the data. We have a couple other things going on in Bison. I almost brought these glasses today, but they wouldn't fit in my pocket. And these are Epson Moverio glasses because Google glasses just aren't geeky enough for my staff. But they work. You can walk out into a forest, and if there are bison points in that forest, the points pop up with the name. We're going to put ones that have photographs. We'll have that coming up soon. So I have some areas along the Appalachian Trail that have been sampled very densely, and it's like you're doing a wildflower walk any time of the year. You can see the photos of the wildflowers in the spring popping up along the trail. So we have some things like that. We also have a project, and this isn't running at Oak Ridge, this is running in the cloud. And what we're doing is taking, I think we have it's in the range of 50,000 species in bison that have enough data and enough data spread out in a way that they will model well, that you can get a reasonable model out of them. About 50,000 species, we're going to run those like this. So this is red wolf distributions, and this was just a raw run, so actually I think a couple of those are from the 1800s. Anyway, so the points are the red wolf, where they've been actually observed. And then this red area is where we predict would be suitable habitat in 2050 according to climate change predictions. And then this is the same model, but what we were running is a list of mustards, which is a family of plants. Your Brussels sprouts and cabbage and things like that are in it. But this is what's been documented there, and then what we think might be there. What might be there and have not been observed, or what could grow there. So we can do things like that, and then you can stack them up so I can get an actual view of a whole ecosystem that might be there in the future that never existed before. And I can see things like if you have a pollinator that's deeply connected to a plant or a disease in its host, you can see that they might have different parameters that determine where they can live, and they might move apart due to climate change, or other ones might come together. We can see all that. So those last two things, they're not ready for prime time yet, but they're coming along. And if anyone wants to see a demo of the Glasses app, I actually have it on my phone. You don't have binocular vision and everything, but I can show you how it works if we go outside. You need a GPS. The Bison needs to know where you are to run it, because otherwise it would just give you everything in the country, and that wouldn't work. All right. So another sort of take on the big data issue is ITIS. ITIS has been around for a long time. It's a database. My ITIS staff are over at the Smithsonian Natural History Museum. And the idea is to have a database of all the names of biological organisms, everything. And we do because taxpayers fund us. We tend to concentrate on North American taxa, because they seem to give us a hard time when we concentrate on stuff in Cambodia and Cameroon. Although we do have to do that sometimes because of invasives. And in fact, we just did a treatment of the fireflies that's going to come out, and they're pretty big in Cambodia. So we need to know what they're doing there. So it's the federal standard for the names of biological organisms, and not all agencies buy into that, but most of them do. And you'll see these things I'll point out a little later called taxonomic serial numbers in federal databases, and that's from ITIS. It plays a foundational role in lots and lots of databases. And that's because people come to our website, they download the whole thing, and then they include it in their laboratory database, or many library databases use the ITIS classification within them. In industry, in academia. In fact, if you go to IKEA and you see they have, for for wood importation things, they have to have a species name on the furniture. You know, what species wood. That's often an ITIS name that's on that tag. You know, and there are lots of places that ITIS feeds it, and we do these analyses. I shouldn't tell you this, but I will. One of the analyses we do to figure out where ITIS shows up is we know when there were mistakes in ITIS, misspellings, bad transliterations and things. We have a whole list of those, and we know exactly what period of time they were in there for. So we can go to Google and do a deep Google search, and what you get is this graph. The stuff that was in there longer is actually on more websites than the stuff that was only in there for a day or two. And we can see our reach, and it's gigantic. It's hundreds of thousands of websites that ITIS is on. You know, and they don't credit us usually, but we know it's ours because it's got our mistakes in it. And even though most big users of ITIS download the whole database and put it into their own system, we still get 50 million page hits a year. So that's pretty impressive. So what are those taxonomic serial numbers? Well, they're like a social security number for a species. And there's a plant named Osmia sinuata, and it's used in pillow stuffing, in organic pillow stuffing. And there's a bee named Osmia sinuata. And if you had a contract and you were buying a bunch of those pillows, you know, you might want to use the taxonomic serial number instead of the Latin name, because it's going to get you a less painful result, I think. And you can't have, those are called homonyms. Can't have a homonym within the same kingdom. That's a rule of taxonomy. But across kingdoms, no problem. There are lots of cross-kingdom homonyms. So the other use here, ITIS is like the Rosetta Stone for big data. Look at this. If I search, and this is an old search, but if I search Google Scholar for Marginaria polypodioides, which is the resurrection fern, I get 15 articles. But if I use ITIS synonymy, I get 814. So think about that. When you're querying big data in biology, in biodiversity, you must use ITIS because you won't get anywhere near the data that you wanted if you don't. And when you're cleaning the data, ITIS is always, except those times I talked about, ITIS is always spelled right, you know, things like that. So you use ITIS as your dictionary to clean the data. And we have ITIS integrated with Bison, and this is actually an example. This is a small example. There are things like Kentucky bluegrass, which grows in every yard around here. It has 60 different names that you find it in databases as. 60 different scientific names are Kentucky bluegrass. There's a raspberry that grows around. It's fairly rare around here, but it grows to the east a little. To the west a little more, called Rubus flagellaris. All right, it has 146 synonyms. 146 other names that it will occur in the database as. And if you don't know that, if you're not using ITIS, you can't do big data kinds of analyses. Won't happen. You know, you're just going to go down the wrong road. What you're going to be doing is analyzing only the stuff that says Rubus encephalius, which is one of those, enslenii, which is one of those synonyms. And you're only going to get, you're not doing big data, you're doing a tiny piece of a big chunk of data. Okay, so that's why ITIS is the power there. And these web services, again, are very important, and there's some addresses that you can have a look at later when this is online. And we have a lot of people using these. We have a lot of programs. We see giant hits come to our web services, and I know that's someone analyzing some giant biodiversity data set, and they're just saying, okay, compare every name in ITIS. And we see that a lot. So now I'm going to tell you an example of, you know, I've had these anecdotal things. Now I'm going to give you an example of sort of big data for conservation and some things you may not have thought of in big data in conservation. So there's GBIF, which I mentioned before, the Global Biodiversity Information Node. and it shares with Bison. Bison has all the U.S. data, and we give it all to GBIF, and they give us all back anything they get, and it's a beautiful sharing arrangement. NSF primarily provides the funding to them from the U.S., but it's a consortium of agencies, State Department, USDA, I think FDA. I'm not sure the whole list of agencies. So we have an investment in GBIF, and they're, it's a good working relationship. There's also eBird is a program at Cornell University, and it's when I was a program officer at NSF, I actually advocated funding of this, and it's one of the most successful projects I ever did that with. It was it's been wildly successful. 200,000 participants, 200 million observations all over the world, lots and lots of countries in there, and they're growing so rapidly. When you graph it out, it looks like they'll hit 1 billion observations in this decade. I mean, that's pretty impressive. And it started 10 years ago at Cornell with a $3 million NSF grant. And this, what you're seeing here is sort of the power of big data. And this is only eBird data in there, but that's the Savannah, is it Savannah sparrows? Yeah. So that's the migration over the 2009 year. And that's taking the actual migration points and then modeling them with a probability around them. But, you can not only figure out that you might have Savannah sparrows in your backyard, but you can figure out what day of the week they're going to be there in what year. That's pretty impressive. And there's something that Steve Kelling, who's the head of this, I couldn't download the file, but he had a file where they're night migrating birds, and no one knew how they move because they migrate at night. You can't see them. But it turns out you can see them on NexRad radar. And the key to figuring that out was that you just had to have a ton of data. And for species that were correlated, and eBird figured out that we could actually come up with a signature, a radar signature for these birds, and watch them migrate across the country on NexRad radar in real time. So that's pretty cool. That's just eBird. There's this other program. In USGS, we have the Patuxent Wildlife Research Center, and it's another, eBird's all citizen science. It's people with a smartphone, take a picture of the bird, the smartphone records where you are, what your name is, what the day is, all that kind of stuff. And it's a lot of, probably, or some of you in this room, have you contributed to eBird? Yeah, well, yeah, there's always one or two. In fact, they have this map on the website where you can see points popping up in real time. And on an afternoon in the summer, you'll see pelican points popping up along the coast on the beach, just like bang, 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 bang. It's amazing. But there's this other data set. And half of it was electronic, but it wasn't delivered to the web. And when I got to USGS, I learned about this data set. And I said, why aren't you putting this on the web? And they said, Stinger, it's so big, every time we do a search on it, it pulls our network down for 20 minutes at the Patuxent Research Center. And they have some good computers there. And when we built Bison, they came to us and they said, let's put them all on Bison, and then we can use your computer to pull them down when we want to do a search. And we can do the same search that they do in 20 minutes. We can do it in 7 seconds. So it's, that's big data. That's optimizing the data and indexing it, putting it in a format that it will search very quickly, putting it in a system where the data is lined up in a way that that the search algorithm can find the data really quickly. Those are all big data techniques. So they've been the cool thing, so eBird's around for a decade. Bird banding program has been around for almost 100 years. So we have that long stretch. Also, the bird banding program, you may or may not identify something right when you take a picture of it with your cell phone. You got a picture, so that's cool, but And they have a lot of experts working, and eBird has made absolutely phenomenal progress in how to get really high quality data out of citizens who are not scientists. They have made phenomenal progress in that. Because it started 100 years ago, Bird Banding Lab took the opposite tact, and they just trained the heck out of the people who do this. And you have to be certified and licensed, and there's a lot of supervision, and experts check all the data. And so this is actually Liz Sellers, who works for me, but she also runs a couple bird banding sites, and she's pulling a hummingbird out of the net. And that's the big thing about the Bird Banding Day. It's bird in hand. You didn't see it flying across the porch and get a blurry photo of it. You had it in your hand. So you could hold it until you figured out exactly what it was. And this is a little girl. I forget her name, actually. Her last name's Grasse, I think. But she's weighing that's a gray catbird. Well, it's a gray catbird butt. And we know it's a gray catbird butt because it's got the orange on it, which means it's a male. But she's weighing it before they release it. So there's a lot of handling of these birds go on. The identifications are solid in the Bird Banding Lab. And it's very highly controlled. There's a lot of data quality control goes on it. So here's the problem. I want to know if Lark buntings are appropriately protected in the U.S., right? That's a Washington kind of problem.
That's a Colorado state bird.
There you go. So where have they been documented historically? We'd have to know what their preferred habitat was. We need to know what that habitat extent across the country, right? These are just common sense, like what do you need to know? All right. So you look in bison, and they're the points for lark bunting, and the analyses I'm going to show you were not done out of bison because bison didn't exist a few years ago when they were done, but now it would be, and it would save them a lot of time. And they're in our program, so they'll do that. But that's lark bunting distribution in bison, all those points, right, 1834 to present. So you need a lot more biodiversity data. You need a lot more data. I just mentioned habitats and things like that. So how do you get that? Any ideas? Where do you have to go to get that? You get in your car and you go to space. That's where you get it. So this is Landsat 8. Most of the data I'm going to show you has come from Landsat, a little bit from 4 and 5, but mostly from Landsat 7 because 8 just launched not long ago. 8's very cool, though. The data comes out is just awesome. You know, it's got one panchromatic band, meaning like a photograph, and then it's got all these other bands that measure other pieces of the spectrum. And the 2 infrared bands are really cool because they show you stuff like you can look at a beet field in Landsat 8 and see where the sweetest beets are because you see nitrogen movement in the leaves gives off a different spectral image. And you can see where the things are photosynthesizing more, so they're going to be sweeter beets. I mean, that's cool, huh? The problem is it's big data. They're generating 5 petabytes of data a year. What's a DVD, like 2 gigabytes? So that's 2.5 million movies they're generating every year, and they got to store that somewhere, you know. So they're hitting some limits. But the data is phenomenally useful, and it's underused because there's so much of it there that it's just hard to address that much data. We'll get there, though. It's a fabulous investment. All right, so what you do is you take Landsat data, and you can classify that Landsat data according to areas that you've ground truth, and you can get all kinds of classifications out of it. And one of them is Cropscape, which is a big database that looks at crops every year in the U.S. Another one's the National Gap Analysis Program, land cover, and that's land cover specifically designed to figure out where species are going to be. So that's very useful. And that's part of the Multi-Resolution Land Characteristics Consortium, the sort of generalized national land cover database. They work together and trade a lot of information. But they all come from Landsat originally. So here's the GAP program, and that's a model of where Lark Buntings, that's their range. That's what GAP thinks their range is. That's what they computed. And what they did was take all those dots, which are now in Bison, they took all those dots and they superimposed them on the classified Landsat data, and then they extracted a model distribution for that. Now, GAP takes one more step. They go ask people, you know, like Red Wolf, I showed you a thing. They'll actually go ask people in the area and say, you know, and the people say, there haven't been red wolves here in 100 years, so they strike that off. You know, they actually ground truth a lot of it. But that's how this was derived. It's, you know, it's land cover from Landsat with the known points superimposed, and then you redistribute that over space. And here's a Lark Bunting Gap analysis, meaning that's where that blue area is where GAP thinks Lark Buntings actually are at some point in the year. And the red parts are how much of that habitat we have protected. So it's not looking very good for the Lark Buntings. All right, so that was an example. Now I'm going to talk about some things about what the federal government is doing, and I wish this was a couple weeks. Hey, stop that. I wish this was a little bit later, like a month later, because December 9th, the week of December 9th, there's going to be a very influential conference in Crystal City at the Marriott. It's called the ACES Conference, a Community for Ecosystem Services, and the Secretary of the Interior is going to make a big announcement there. I wish she would have done it a couple weeks ago, but we'll skirt that issue. She's going to announce a couple different really important things there. Tune in. And I think it'll be webcast. I'm not positive. And some of it has to do with federal data sharing. So I'm co-chair of a working group that's part of the National Science and Technical Committees. So I mentioned the PCAST before, the President's Council of Advisors. There's like this parallel effort. They're all non-feds. There's this parallel effort that OSTP, Office of Science and Technology Policy, coordinates for the White House that is all feds. So I'm co-chair of this working group. The working group's been around for a long time. We do informatics. You can read here what we do. And our whole mission is to facilitate sharing, mobilization, interoperability of federal data. So we get together at least quarterly, often lately, much more often, and discuss this kind of thing. And in that PCAST report that I mentioned, the one Rosina Bierbaum at the very beginning, she co-authored, they had a concept that they called Informa. And we all hated that name, but we loved the concept. And the idea, this is our interpretation of that idea, BioEco's interpretation of that idea. None of this is real, okay? But it's what we thought we could move toward with a data.gov community and the Geo platform, which is the National Geospatial Platform, which is run through FGDC, which is the Federal Geospatial Data Committee, which is an interagency thing. And the idea is that you have these hubs for each part of environmental data. So you get a hub that's big enough to really dominate a theme, a thematic area, but it's small enough to mostly fit in one agency, so you don't get the tragedy of the commons with funding. One agency will love it and fund it and keep it going. Yeah, so that's the crux of it. And Bison was proposed as the biodiversity hub. There's a beautiful hub in EPA called EnviroAtlas. It has tons and tons of ecosystem services data. And then that land cover data is MRLC, which I already mentioned. And the Geo platform is right now experimenting with a viewer to integrate all these data, and it's doing some really impressive things. Some of the mashups that you can get. Just the other day, I sat with their little prototype, and I popped up in Bison, I popped up an endangered species, a set of populations in the southeast, and it's a little Amphiuma, a little thing that looks like it's as close as you can get to a snake without actually being a snake because you have legs. That's what an amphium is. So there's an endangered one-toed amphium in the southeast. And I said, show me the populations of that. And I said, put NextRad radar under it. And I watched the loop going under it. And I watched a giant thunderstorm go over the amphiuma populations. Now, they're lizards. They like thunderstorms. But if that was something that, if that was a tornado passing over a bird nesting area, you would have a different story, right? So that's this viewer, and this stuff is still being worked out how exactly we're going to do that, but that's what BioEco has been working on for the last couple of years. That's what we're going to keep working on, is this interoperability and full mashability, which is a real challenge. You don't just go to a website and bring in layers and think that they're going to superimpose on one another in a way that they're usable. Doesn't happen, I can guarantee it. But if you put some work into it, into making those data truly mashable, we had an issue with Cropscape, which I showed you, the crop database. It wasn't fitting right with everything else, and we thought, what the heck is going on? They followed all the standards. And it turns out they're projecting their data in Albers equal area projection. And I'm going, what are you thinking? And the guy goes, this is Cropscape, Stinger. If I'm a farmer and I spent a lot of time making a perfectly square or rectangular field, I want it to appear perfectly rectangular or square on the map. And I said, I guess that's true. And that's what Albers equal area projection does. It makes squares squares. With latitude and longitude, they can go like this. So, there are reasons for this. It's all reasonable. We just have to get together and talk about it. So, and in closing, so that whole Informa contract concept that I told you about, like it's not a done deal because we're on a CR and we don't have a president's budget, but this is in the president's budget language, and there's a link to it, so I'm proving it's on the web. And this is where we're headed with the Eco-Informa concept, and you can read more about it in that PCAST report. If you read that report, it says we need a new government agency to do that. I don't think that's going to happen. So that's why we're pursuing it in different ways. So anyway, thank you very much. Was I okay on time? Yeah. And if you have any questions, you can email me directly. It's gguala@USGS, gguala@usgs.gov. Or if you have questions, like general questions about bison, you want some of those widgets we said that I mentioned, things like that, just email bison@usgs.gov. It works.
You can take some questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
Could you repeat the question because
Sure.
recording?
Sure. Oh, I have to be over here. Sorry. Makes me crazy to stand in one place. Yes.
You talked about mashups and how you had difficulty with some of the layers. I have a request that I'm asking you to consider, whether it's going to work for you. That when I've talked with other librarians and their researchers are trying to make mashups, it can be very difficult to deliver an end product. Not just doing it, but the different layers come from different places. So there's a big problem, the ones who are aware of it and care, with, the provenance of that data.
Yeah.
Where did it come from? Who did it? When was it done?
Right.
Basic metadata. So that
Yep.
people can show, okay, this layer was done in this projection. This is why it's screwing up, because this other layer was in another projection.
So the
I'm hoping that, I know you're not going to require metadata like that with your mashups.
You
but
bet we
I'm
are.
hoping- Oh, you are?
Yeah, we.
I
So
thought
you don't.
said you're not gonna
What you
require it.
probably don't. Okay, so that viewer that I showed right now, it doesn't have. Oh, sorry. The question was, are we going to require metadata with layers in mashups that we're dealing with for BioEco, and the Eco-Informa concept? As we move forward, trying to make federal data more mobile and Mashable, basically. So I sit in the FGDC suite at USGS, so I can't do anything without metadata. You know, we have, there's a whole series of projects in the agencies to generate data catalogs that are based on metadata records. USGS has what's called the Science Data Catalog, and it's all ISO. You know, FGDC metadata format is moving to ISO. The community is moving that way. But it's all metadata records, and then those filter up to data.gov, and you can get them there. So yeah, metadata is a big part of this. When you're especially geospatial layers, you have to have metadata. I agree. Other data, you know, there are different arguments on that, but on geospatial layers, you got to have some metadata. In some of the mashups that I showed, you know, they're just to get to a point, and they're usually at low resolution. So once that's been figured out, sometimes it's an illustration rather than a living thing. And at that point, you know, you have to look at your resource constraints. But yeah, metadata is a big part of this. I'm with you on that. Yeah.
Can you talk a little about whether this can go global at all, whether there are other countries that do similar things that we can know that
So
be integrated?
whether what can go
Well,
growth?
Bison, I mean, you are only showing data for the U.S.
Right, but remember I put GBIF up there for that specific reason, because GBIF is the global version of Bison.
Okay.
And actually it's much older, so Bison's the US version of GBIF, basically. And we share data completely between those two. So that part's done. We love that. The whole data sharing thing, there are a couple global initiatives. GEOS, the Global Earth Observing System of Systems, I think it's called. There are a lot of global initiatives to do this. But it's challenging. You know, when I right before we released Bison, the Canadians said, why don't you come up? We'd love to have Canada included in Bison. And we're probably going to do that eventually, to be perfectly candid, just because it's getting sort of silly to stop everything at the 49th parallel. But, you know, I thought this was a slam dunk. I thought, oh, we just open it up, it's fine. And we looked at all the soil layers are different, all the environmental layers are different, and there's little kriging errors in them and stuff, and man, it didn't work. And I was flabbergasted that we couldn't just open up Canada and it would all be beautiful. But there are challenges, even with Canada. You know, really, seriously. I mean, I lived in Africa for 2 years on the border between Zimbabwe and Botswana, and there were climate stations at the border posts. And when you look at the data, they're wildly different. And the border posts are 50 feet apart. We would have coffee together in the morning. Wildly different data. You know, and it's a difference between the Botswana government culture of when they take the data and the Zimbabwe different government culture. And one of them was evaporating before they got around to it. Yeah, that kind of thing. So anyway, tough challenge, but people are working on it. Anything else? Yeah.
I have one more question. When I talk to some researchers, they seem to be completely unaware that many librarians, not all of them, but many of them have specialized in data librarianship, data management, and data curation. And they pretty much know they really know what you're talking about when you're talking about data quality and formatting and clean data and all of that. And yet there seems to be a lack of communication, and I blame the librarians, because I mean, it's your job to let them know. It's not the researcher's job to find out, okay, what do you know? This is my opinion. What do you know that I need to know? What do you suggest to librarians, especially those who know about data curation, data management? What do you suggest to them to help give the message to researchers, hey, we can really help you with all of this. You don't have to do it all yourselves. Just ask us.
So the question is, what can a librarian who's trained in data analysis and curation say to a researcher to encourage them to let the librarian help them. This is an issue I've dealt with for a very long time because I've always spanned that data and biology. My PhD is in biology. It's not in computer science. And I totally sympathize. And I think there are a couple levels to it. One is that, as I was saying about metadata, in my own opinion only, with geospatial layers, you must have that because there's a format, there's a whole set of descending formats that the data's in. If you go out and you do a set of observations on mole rats, then that's a different kind of thing that you're doing. And most biologists who work on mole rats are never going to look at an FGDC metadata record. What they're going to do is go look at the materials and methods section of the scientific article that was published about those. So it's a different class of issues. The other thing is a lot of, and I'm only talking about biologists because I know biologists because I am one, a lot of biologists will they will assume that people don't have street cred unless they've shown not that they can manage the data really well, but that they can collect it. And in fact, when we started Bison, I took my lead programmers and my data staff, and we went out in the woods around USGS, and we took data points. And we did things like, I remember we took a point on a tree, and they went like this, and the tree was over here, and they just happened to have good signal over here. I said, is that point really on the tree? Well, no, it isn't. And they never thought about that before. And, there are all kinds of things like that. And back when GPS units were really slow and expensive, I had one, and I used to put it on the place where it would get a signal and then walk for 100 yards around it. Those were my points. So my computer science people would look at that data, and they would very reasonably say there's 7 digits of precision in that lat long. That's down to inches, right? And they would say, hey, we can put circles around each data point based on that accuracy. I'm going, that's not accuracy, it's precision. The accuracy is completely different. On my points, it was like more or less 100 yards. And they're going, but you had 7 digits of precision. I said, well, that's what the GPS put out. And so there's that level of street cred that I think makes a big difference with researchers. I don't have that's my really candid answer. I'll probably get yelled at for it, but that's what I see a lot of the time.
That's what many researchers really feel then.
Yeah. And there's also if you're in a publish or perish situation and you have a lot of data that you haven't published yet, and I have data sitting at home that is 25, 30 years old that I haven't published. And I haven't given it to anyone either because it's full of errors. I know it. And I really want someone else, I want to go through it and clean it up before I let anyone else see it. And that's just me, and I'm the most data giving person you'll ever see. Now anyone on the other side of that spectrum, you're not going to get a thing out of them until they feel like they're confident in the data. We see that in federal agencies all the time because there's liability associated with releasing data. So the president says you have to, digital is, things should go out, things should be made open as the default. Well, if I'm a park superintendent and I have endangered species in my park, I'm putting exact locations for rare orchids that people could go collect, even though the data's FOIable, right? There's still some liability on me, and I got to think about my competing needs, and I have to have some solution. I'm not saying there isn't a solution, because I think there is in that case, but I have to think about it, and I've never thought about having to release the data before. I've just thought, well, the easiest thing is not to release it. And by not releasing it, I mean don't show it to anyone, like a librarian, even, So that's what I'm talking about. You have to know the situation intimately to really do this well. we in Bison, 3 of my staff are biologists in Bison, and so they've all done field work. I showed you Liz Sellers picking a hummingbird out of a net. She just published a good biological paper the other day. And they sit with data providers. It'll be many, many meetings a lot of the time. Hours and hours of time talking about the very little trivial details of is it appropriate to release this data in this way? You know, bird people don't care a lot of the time whether you have endangered species, but because, you know, birds fly around. But plant people, you know, and they have good reason for that. And it's different in every situation. So they want to know that you fully understand all the parameters around the data. So it just takes a lot of time, you know, which means it takes resources. Anyway, that's what I got.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.